joining us for TNT, our Faith Ministries Church weekly Bible study Tuesday night teaching. Before we do another thing, let's start with the privilege we call prayer. Lord, thank you. Thank you for always having us in your care, and for the times like this when you bring us together to praise you and to study and learn more about you. Watch over our pastor and our First Lady, and please use me in the way they're trusting me in their absence. But even more important, Lord, use me in the way you're trusting me in your presence to share your word with your people who you know by their names and know just how you want your message to reach each of them individually and collectively. We love you, and we love how you love us. Amen. So, if by some chance you're not familiar with Faith Ministries, we invite you to join us every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time for this virtual Bible study. We don't hold you long. This evening I'll share with you for just the next 30 minutes or so, and when our pastor is back, he then closes out his Bible study by staying online to answer any questions you might have. We also invite you to join us for a Sunday morning worship service at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, either in person at 2747 Agler Road on the northeast side of Columbus, Ohio, or virtually on our Facebook page or YouTube, or by logging into our website at faithministries.church. Now, of course, if you're a Faith Ministries member or a regular attendee, you know that as we record this particular TNT, Tuesday night teaching, our pastor, Dr. C. Dexter Wise III, and our First Lady, Dr. Shirley D. Wise, are taking well-deserved vacation time for the month of August. They'll be back in the pulpit the first weekend in September, just in time for our Holy Communion, but don't wait until then to join us. The rest of us are holding it down as best we can, and even better, God is still on the throne and still here in the house until our pastor and First Lady get back in September. You know, for as long as I can remember in the decades now that I've had the pleasure of having Dr. Wise as my just extraordinary spiritual mentor and preacher and teacher, and during the years when I've lived elsewhere and been under the watch care of others, like many of us, taking time off in August has been their habit. They need a break. And so in thinking about Pastor Wise's break as being what's led me to have the honor and the responsibility of being here with you to fill in as best I can, it inspired me to take as my topic for this Bible study, Lord, give me a break. Or depending on your mood, you might want to phrase that to, Lord, I need a break. So our topic for the next 30 minutes is, Lord, give me a break. Now, we all know that taking a break is a good thing. It helps replenish you and restore you and refresh you and maybe even reform you, because some of us get a bit beside ourselves when we need a break and we start acting in ways or threatening to act in ways that cause others to think we may need a bit of not just relaxation, but rehabilitation. So we know that taking a break is a good thing, but in this session we'd like to study how to make taking a break not just a good thing, but a God thing. Now, in your Bibles, when we turn to the Word, we see plenty of examples of when biblical characters needed and took a break. By one count, there are more than 500 examples of the Bible mentioning the term rest. Even though this is Bible study, we're not going to go through all these and dissect the deeper theological meaning, but what we will do is to summarize a number of those examples and practical life applications too, in the form of several passages we'll focus on to help us distinguish between a break that's just a good thing, which is good, and a break that's a God thing, and that's transformational. So let's begin. The Bible has numerous examples of when Jesus himself took a break. For the short time we have together here this evening, let's focus on several passages first within the book of Mark. Now, Mark is believed to be the oldest of the four Gospels and the shortest, and some might say the simplest. For example, the book of Mark doesn't address the birth of Jesus at all. It focuses on Jesus' mighty works that publicly demonstrate that he is who he says he is. The book of Moses stresses Jesus' work as a servant of God, serving others while humbly insisting that the attention and praise go to God and not to him. Jesus is shown as an evangelist, preaching, teaching, healing, on the go, in a way that sounds familiar perhaps to those of you who need a break yourselves. So let's go to Mark 1:32-39, the first chapter of Mark, verses 32 through 39. Now, you think you're busy? In these verses, Jesus was consumed with the types of stress and responsibilities that you and I can't even imagine. You think you have a demanding job? Jesus was performing miracles and saving souls and preaching and teaching. And so in verses 32, 33, and the beginning of 34, and again, we're in the first chapter of the book of Mark, talk about working overtime. It was after sunset, and Jesus was still healing the sick and casting out demons. We see that evening after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door. And Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out demons. And after that, Jesus needed a break. Mark 1:35 says, "The next morning, Jesus awoke long before daybreak and went out alone in the wilderness to pray." Jesus took a break, but not for long, because in Mark 1:36, Simon and his companions went to look for him. And when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone is looking for you." Jesus replied, "Let us go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That is why I have come." So he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. Looks like Jesus might need a break again soon. So the first point I'd like you to consider is that Jesus traveled light. He traveled light. When Jesus needed a break, he didn't always have time to make big advanced plans. He didn't check his calendar, book a reservation. Hopefully each one of us finds some time every day to take at least a quick break, a good break, to take a stretch and to take a deep breath. And hopefully you take the time, or more than likely you have to make the time, like Jesus did, to include at least a little bit of God in your daily break. We just know that makes the rest of the day better. And some of you who already take God breaks may say, there's nothing new to learn here, but I would say to those of us who think we're already experienced travelers, good. It's time to go from our spiritual cabin seats to first class, from weekend getaways to extended excursions. And so to make the most of these getaways that are not just good, but instead all about God, remember Jesus traveled light, and he didn't let his preparation for the break overshadow the purpose for the break. Sometimes our preparation for our break might overshadow our purpose for the break. And some of you might be able to relate to me. When I take my hopefully daily break, I might get up, brush my teeth, fix my coffee. If I'm going out for a walk, I take the time to charge my mobile device and get my headphones so I can listen to my music while I'm walking. I make that gospel music if it's a God break. And then I stretch and try to, put on something to look presentable, even if I know I'm going to sweat. Then I go get a towel in case I do sweat, and my keys and my fanny pack, and that's okay. Or if you're not a walker, but instead you're going to try to sit a spell for your breaks, you might take along your book of devotions, maybe a pen and some paper to do some journaling, and that's fine too. But for Jesus, when he took not just a good break, but a God break, his only preparation was to focus on his purpose. His only preparation was to focus on his purpose. And that helps keep your God break righteous and not just a ritual. Sometimes we let our God breaks over time become just a ritual. Instead, make it righteous like Jesus did. And near and dear to my heart, it doesn't seem like Jesus took a lot of baggage along. Of course, now in the reality of our world, if we're really taking a break, if we're really going somewhere like Jesus did, we pack a bag. And I confess, I usually pack a few bags. Yes, I confess I'm an overpacker. I confess I'm the one holding my breath as the airline weighs my luggage, hoping it doesn't go over the 50-pound limit. And if we're traveling by car, I'm the one who has the bag that we end up doing what I call cram and slam. You know what I mean? We cram the bag in the trunk and we slam the lid, hoping it doesn't pop open again. Or maybe we run out of the house with the extra piece of luggage at the last minute, the cooler with the travel snacks, and we put it on the back seat between the two back seat passengers who have to hold it stable and not complain about it. I was the youngest child of 3, and so I always had to sit in the middle of the back seat with the extra piece of luggage in my lap or on the floor on the hump between my feet. And one more thing, before you underpackers start hating on us overpackers, know that you underpackers may be part of the problem. You're the ones who are always going to ask us if we remember to pack the scissors, or you'll ask us if we have room in our carry-on bags for your folded up jacket or your oversized wallet. But Jesus, when he took not just a good break, but a God break, he traveled light. And if we want to take not just a good break, which is good, but a God break, we need to try to unpack our baggage too when we spend time with the Lord. A good break is supposed to be a break from our worldly circumstances. So why do we bring all that extra stuff when we take a good break like a vacation? Well, I bring an extra set of clothes just in case I need them and an extra pair of shoes. I don't have to. It's my choice. But when I get to where I'm going and back home again, I find I really didn't need all that stuff. Dragging all that extra baggage along with me was just an extra burden, just weight I could have shed if I had unpacked some of those bags. A godly break is not about our stuff. It's not just a good break from people, places, and things. A godly break is a break from our disbelief. A godly break is a break from our fear. It's a break from our wavering faith. So just like Jesus, we don't have to drag all that extra baggage of anxiety and doubt just in case we need them. We won't. We don't have to drag all those bags into our godly breaks. And yes, you can come to Jesus just as you are. And we usually always have a lot on our minds. So if that means you just can't help dragging some baggage into your time with the Lord, then at least allow him to help repack you. Just like Jesus did. He went to be replenished, repacked. Just like that family member who always makes you take all the luggage back out of the trunk so they can repack it. Just like you may have to rearrange your shoes in your bag to make room for your toiletries. Allow God to rearrange your worries to make room for your peace. Move your grief aside just a little bit to allow for some gratitude. And the more you try that, packing just a little lighter, maybe you'll learn to start packing differently for a new season with God. Maybe you just take a light jacket instead of a heavy overcoat. Maybe learn how instead of one-way monologues with God to have two-way dialogues instead, where you can just not ask him for things, but also then be still and listen for his response. So allow God to take the stress and replace it with the strength you'll find in him. Allow him to unpack your anger and your resentment to make room for forgiveness and love. Purge that stuff and leave all that junk with God. To take a godly break, travel light. And one last thing about this first point, that Jesus traveled light on his God breaks. You may ask, does that mean you can't take someone along with you? Well, in this particular scripture, Jesus did go alone, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. But Jesus sometimes did take others with him. Throughout the Bible, there are numerous instances of Jesus taking people along with him to pray. And a prayer partner can be a good thing. My best prayer partner and I often joke, it's kind of a joke and kind of for real. We're so in tune with each other that sometimes we have to remind each other, okay, talk to God first about our issues, and then pick up the phone and talk to each other. So a prayer partner, a traveling buddy is okay. But for your God breaks, what about if you first consider that you're already traveling along with your best biblical friends, Grace, and Grace's best traveling companion, Mercy? For a godly break, God's grace and mercy will be right there with you, and that'll be a trip. And while you're on that break, you might need to take a look around for that travel companion you can take with you anywhere, no matter what the circumstances. While you're on that break, look for joy. Joy's your birthright, but maybe you need an angelic Amber Alert because your joy seems to have been missing for a while. Maybe you left it at work or with a so-called friend or in a relationship you should have left sooner. Maybe you misplaced joy in a conversation you had with yourself about your own insecurities. So on your God breaks, be sure to don't claim your bags, claim your joy. So that first point, when Jesus needed to take not just a good break, but a God break, he traveled light, and so should we. Matthew 11:28 through 30, light. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Here's one of those 500 biblical references to rest. Take my yoke upon you, obey him, submit to him, and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Because the second point, if you want to take a break that's not just a good break, but instead a God break, you have to travel light, because your God break can't just be traditional. Jesus took untraditional timeouts. Now, notice it in our text, Mark 1:35, which we already read, that Jesus went to the wilderness for his break. And he went to the wilderness alone. Mark 1:35 says, the next morning, Jesus awoke long before daybreak and went out alone in the wilderness to pray. Jesus needed a break. The COVID pandemic has given new meaning to the word alone. Depending on your personality and your circumstances, being alone can range from, where are you on this scale? Being alone can range from being terrifying to being depressing to being okay sometimes to being your preferred state most of the time. Right now, we're not going to have a traditional conversation about the difference between being alone and being lonely, or ways to combat feelings of isolation, which is real. Other than to say, if those issues are issues for you, then please don't hesitate to seek help if you need it. Yes, God will always be with you, but if God is telling you to get help for feelings of isolation, then please get that help. What we're going to talk about now, though, is to understand that when Jesus took his godly breaks, these weren't traditional timeouts. What Jesus searched for was not just being alone in the sense that we are when we take our good breaks. You don't even really have to be alone to take a God break. Have you ever been, for example, in a church full of people, but you just know the pastor's message is aimed just for you and only you, just like there's nobody else there? Or you could be all alone. Yes, I spent my time all alone with God today, but your brain was so consumed with that baggage, thinking about what's next on your to-do list, that you forget the devotion you just read by the time you leave the quiet room you went to alone to read it. So in Jesus' non-traditional timeouts, being alone meant being with God in solitude. In solitude. If you look at other scriptures, when Jesus went away in the Bible, they often say he went to the desert or the mountaintop or a desolate place. Different translations of the same verse we just read don't always use the term alone. They say Jesus went to pray in a solitary place. Solitude. Solitude. That kind of aloneness, solitude, is not a state of being, nor even a state of mind. It's a state of our spirit. Remember Matthew 11:29 that we just read said that God's light burden will give you rest, not for your tired feet, not for your aching back, not for your overworked brain, but for your soul. That's not just a traditional timeout. In Jesus' non-traditional timeout with God, he sought solitude. When Jesus took his God break, he didn't just go alone, he went into solitude to get his spirit in sync. And we need that too. I've heard it said that we're not human beings going through a spiritual experience, we're spiritual beings going through a human experience. Are we human beings going through a spiritual experience, or are we spiritual beings going through a human experience? And if it's the latter, we need the solitude of those non-traditional God breaks, not just to restore our humanness, but to restore our spirituality. A non-traditional godly break, not just to restore our human beings, that's a good break, but to restore our spiritual beings, that's a God break. So, here's good news. We already said that you can just travel light and not plan ahead, so you can take that non-traditional God break into a state of spiritual solitude when you're anywhere at any time, just like Jesus did. You can take a non-traditional God break into a state of spiritual solitude at work, walking down the hall from that meeting, or when that customer service person doesn't serve you as a customer, you can go into a state of spiritual solitude, oneness with God. Or here's an example. Have you ever had an out-of-body moment when you're talking to your child? Turn that into a God break if you need to. You can't leave the situation, but you can change the circumstances and maybe the consequences by taking an immediate spiritual non-traditional timeout, a God break. And so how do we do that? How do we enter into that state of solitude? Well, it would seem to be a lot simpler for Jesus to experience that kind of oneness with God than for you and me to do that. Because, well, as we learn all through the New Testament, the Gospels that we're looking at, and all through the Bible, Jesus is one with God. But can we at least try to seek that type of solitude? Can we try to become one with God when we need to take not just a good break, but a God break? Well, we are made in the image of God, and we know the nature of God. So to increase our oneness with God, could we start with love? Could we start with compassion? Because remember that baggage you unpack to make room for spiritual solitude like this? Unpack forgiveness, unpack anger, unpack disappointment to help bring you into that place of being spiritually alone with God, of being one with God, of being in solitude with God. In Jesus' godly breaks and in our godly breaks, our aloneness is symbolic for saying we're seeking solitude to savor time with God. Savor, not just be alone with God, but to savor it. Savor. Think about how you savor your cell phone, how you rely on it and can't live without it. No, let's not think about that. Let's try a better example. Think about the difference between eating fast food versus eating a sit-down meal. They can both give you a break from your hunger, but one you just savor so much more that you don't wolf it down, you abide in it. And even better, because some of us like fast food, think not just of the difference between fast food and a sit-down meal, but a sit-down home-cooked meal. Okay? Think of your favorite home-cooked meal and how it can transport you into a whole different realm. It's a whole different vibe, a whole experience. And that's what the wilderness represents too in our passage for this evening. Jesus went to the wilderness, a different realm, a place of searching, a place of barrenness, of nothingness, where you could get lost, but if you search for Jesus there, you could get found. In his non-traditional break, his non-traditional timeout, Jesus traveled light and went in solitude to savor his oneness with God in an environment open to spiritual transformation. Spiritual transformation, because that's the third point, spiritual transformation. When you take a God break, when you travel light, when you create a non-traditional timeout, the purpose is to come back transformed. Here's an example. Again, in the book of Mark, this time the 3rd chapter, verses 13 and 14, Jesus went up on a mountainside and something transformative happened. He called to him those he wanted, and they came to him, and he appointed 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach. Jesus took a godly break on the mountainside, and then something transformational happened. He chose his 12. Here's another example from Matthew of when a godly break resulted in something transformational. In Matthew 14, Jesus needed a break. The book of Matthew, again the Gospels, is said to be focused on Matthew declaring that Jesus is in fact the long-awaited prophesied Messiah. But in Matthew 14, even the Messiah, Jesus, needed a break. Jesus had found out some terrible news. John the Baptist had been beheaded. Think about how that news must have impacted Jesus. John the Baptist was a preacher and a teacher in his own right, we know, and he and Jesus had been close. They were kin folks. When Jesus' mother Mary went to tell her blood relative Elizabeth about her impending virgin birth, she found out about another miracle, that Elizabeth at a ripe old age was pregnant with her miracle child, John the Baptist, who leaped for joy in the womb when he heard Mary talking. But even more than his birth, throughout his life, John the Baptist had been one of the most vocal prophets about the coming of the Messiah, even correcting those who thought he might be the Messiah, and he had even baptized Jesus. So, of course, Jesus needed a break when he found out the tragedy of John the Baptist's death. Have you ever needed a break after learning about something tragic? So it says in Matthew chapter 14, verse 13, that when Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. But as you proceed through verses 13 to 21, the crowds followed him, and he ended up again not staying in his solitude for long just then, just like some of you, but instead he clocked in again and performed the well-known miracle of feeding the crowd with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, all in a day's work for Jesus. By Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 and 23, Jesus again tried to take a break. He dismissed the crowd. He sent his disciples on ahead of him in a boat, and he went up on a mountainside all by himself to pray. Scripture says later that night, when Jesus was still there alone, but here's the transformation. When he came out of his solitude, he not only himself walked on water to get to the boat that had gotten caught in the storm, but in Matthew 14, verses 24 to 33, he ended up teaching Peter how to walk on water through the power of transformative faith. And when you take a good break, you may come back relaxed. You may come back tanned. You may come back with lifelong memories. You may come back broke. You may come back with a record number of pictures and videos to post on Facebook and Instagram. Yes, I said fake book and I said Instagram. Or you may come back even more exhausted than when you left if your break involved ripping and running like mine usually do. But when you take a God break, when it's over, you don't want just memories. You want to know something transformative happened. Your transformation may be gradual. It may not be as externally amazing as literally walking on water. Most of us shouldn't try that trick, although you can walk on water if you know its symbolic meaning. But when you have a God break, one where you travel light, one that's a non-traditional timeout, you should feel something start to change on the inside, a transformation. Because you may have just been seeking a break, but if you take a God break, and not just a good break, God might not just give you a break, he may give you a breakthrough. Reflect on that. Because just like the Apostle Paul tells the believers in the book of Ephesians, the 3rd chapter, verses 20 to 21, that God can do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, you may have just asked God for a break. But if you're not careful, what God will give you may not be just a break. It may be a breakthrough. Or godly transformation could be not just in the form of a godly break, but a godly breakthrough. What's a godly breakthrough? Well, we're almost out of time, so maybe I'll ask Dr. Wise to address biblically when he returns from his break. What is a breakthrough? But for now, I just want to give you my testimony, not biblically, but practically. For those of us who have had breakthroughs, I can only say that even if I can't explain it, you'll know when it happens. That check you weren't expecting, that person who appeared out of nowhere, that position you prayed for that you didn't get, but the Lord sent something even better that you couldn't have gotten if what you had prayed for had manifested. Nobody can tell your breakthrough story like you can. Your transformative breakthrough could even come in the form of something you've seen happen over and over and over again in your life, but it never fails to amaze you when God does it again. We used to have summer reruns of our favorite TV shows that would go on break for the summer. We don't have that as much now because we have 24/7 programming and streaming services, but it's the same effect. Do you have a movie, for example, and you've watched it over and over and over again so much that you know all the key characters and can repeat with them all their key lines that happen at all the key times, but yet you still act like every time you've seen it, you act like you have never seen it before? So that's how some of our breakthroughs are. We know God can do it. We've seen him do it before. But when he does it again, it feels like a breakthrough all over again. I tell my son that when something happens in a way that you could never have imagined, despite all your planning, despite all your life experience, all your work experience, all your education, when something happens and life turns in your favor in a way you never could have imagined, that's a breakthrough. That's you getting not just a good break, but a God break. You traveled light, you went seeking a non-traditional timeout, and you had a breakthrough. And you were transformed. And in that way, your godly break will be triumphant. A triumphant transformation. Lord, I need a break. Can you give me a break? Not just a good break, but a God break. You don't have to do a lot of planning. You can first travel light. Jesus just had to slip away when he could, but that means he could do it over and over whenever he needed to, just like you can, without a huge budget, without having to take time off, without so much planning that you forget your purpose, without a lot of baggage. And second, you can make your break not just a traditional timeout. You don't have to be all alone physically to seek that spiritual solitude. And then third, expect a transformation and know that that transformation could be in the form of not just a break, but a breakthrough that will allow you to emerge triumphantly. Just one final thought as we close this evening. If you bring back worldly souvenirs from your good breaks, maybe you could bring others back a spiritual souvenir from your God break. When Dr. Wise comes back from his August break, every year he returns with new vision and new energy and new plans that impact the whole church. The energy just shifts that morning when he takes the pulpit again. And as for you, we may not come down from the mountain with a tablet like Moses when we come back from our God breaks, but could we just maybe smile a little more? Chances are somebody around us, everybody around us, needs a break too. Not just a good break, but a God break. Can we close with prayer? Can we close with prayer? Lord, if even Jesus needed a break, we know that that's your divine will for us too. Help us to travel light, leaving all of our baggage with you and taking along your grace and mercy and looking for our joy. Help us to be prepared for a non-traditional timeout, one in which, whether we're alone or with the multitudes, we search for the spiritual solitude we need to savor our relationship with you. Transform us, Lord, through giving us not just a break, but a breakthrough so we can emerge triumphantly in the kind of triumph that only you can create, to be a break not just for ourselves, but for others in your kingdom. We thank you, we thank you, we thank you for all you've done in the past, and we thank you in advance for all that's yet to come. Sending you this postcard of praise from all your people. Amen. Thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight for TNT.